The last betrayal doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it comes quietly, typed, signed, dated, and filed away while you're still setting the table, still running errands, still believing you belong. Here's the question that refuses to go away. What would you do if your parents erased you from their lives on paper, just days before they died? Not years before, not after a fight, but 72 hours. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. 3 days. Long enough to feel intentional. Short enough to feel like a message. Nick says that's when everything snapped. And if you're thinking this story begins with violence, stop right there. That's not where it starts. It starts with silence. With legal language. With a decision made behind closed doors by the two people who were supposed to protect you. This isn't just a story about death. It's a story about being written out while you're still alive. And before you decide what you think you know, ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many families look perfect from the outside, while quietly deciding who matters on the inside? Because from the street, the Reiner home looked untouchable. Gated, calm, expensive in the way money whispers instead of shouts. A place where nothing truly bad could happen. The kind of place where tragedy feels like it belongs to other people. And yet, according to Nick, he was already gone long before anyone was found. Erased. Not by distance. Not by estrangement. But by a document. Nick lived on the property. Close enough to hear doors. Close enough to see lights go out. Close enough to believe he was still part of the family orbit. But not close enough, he says, to be chosen. That contradiction matters. Because proximity creates illusion. You can be near love without receiving it. You can be loyal without being valued. You can give everything and still be disposable. Nick says he spent years proving himself. Showing up. Being reliable. Staying quiet when others didn't. And in return, he believed something simple. That loyalty would be recognized. That blood would count. That when the time came, he wouldn't be left behind. Then came the discovery. Nick claims he learned that a new will had been drafted. Not casually. Not as a future plan. But finalized. Locked in. And according to him, it removed him completely. No inheritance. No acknowledgement. No explanation. Everything redirected. And when you hear that, you might think, so what? Parents change wills all the time. That's true. But timing changes everything. 3 days before their deaths. 3 days before history froze. 3 days before Nick says he realized he didn't exist in the family story anymore. Imagine that moment. You're not fighting. You're not estranged. You're still there. And suddenly, you realize the future you assumed was never yours. Nick described it as being erased while standing in the same space. Like a chair being pulled out behind you without warning. And here's where the story gets dangerous. Because once someone believes they've been erased, they stop acting like someone who belongs. They start acting like someone who has nothing left to lose. But hold on. This is where most people rush to judgment. They hear a claim like that and immediately decide what it means. So pause. Ask yourself something harder. Is being cut out of a will just about money? Or is it about meaning? Because inheritance isn't only about dollars. It's about acknowledgement. About proof that your place mattered enough to be permanent. Nick says that will told him something louder than words ever could. That despite years of loyalty, he was temporary, replaceable, disposable. And that realization didn't come with a conversation. It didn't come with an explanation. It came, he says, through discovery. Through legal language that doesn't care how it makes you feel. Cold. Precise. Final. What do you do with that kind of knowledge? Do you confront it? Do you swallow it? Do you pretend you never saw it? Or does it rot inside you until everything you thought you knew collapses? Nick says something else matters here. Something most people ignore. The silence. No one warned him. No one explained. No one softened the blow. If the will had changed, it changed without him. And that silence, according to Nick, felt intentional. Like a decision already made about who deserved to know. Now think about this. If someone believes their parents have already decided they don't matter, what happens to the emotional rules they've been living by? Because rules only work when you believe you're still part of the game. Nick says that discovery reframed everything. Every memory, every interaction, every look he thought meant something. Suddenly, the past didn't feel stable anymore. It felt rewritten. And here's where the story pulls you in, whether you like it or not. Because Nick wasn't some distant figure. He wasn't gone. He was there, living on the same property, existing in the same orbit, watching a family continue as if nothing had changed. That kind of closeness without belonging is psychological torture. It creates a split reality. On the outside, everything looks normal. On the inside, you're unraveling. And if you think that unraveling happens all at once, you're wrong. It happens slowly, quietly, in moments no one notices. Nick says he didn't explode. He didn't scream. He didn't storm in demanding answers. Instead, he did what he had always done. He stayed quiet. He observed. He tried to make sense of it. And that's what makes this story terrifying. Because the most dangerous emotional collapses don't announce themselves. They disguise themselves as patience, as restraint, as loyalty. Now let's talk about the sisters. Because according to reports, one of them would later tell police something that changed the direction of everything. A warning. A sentence that suggested the danger wasn't outside the family. Think about that. What has to happen inside a household for someone to say that? What conversations occurred before anyone knew they mattered? And more importantly, what did Nick believe they already knew? Nick claims he felt erased not just legally, but emotionally. That the will wasn't the first sign. It was the confirmation of something he'd been feeling for years. Favoritism, distance, subtle exclusions, moments where he wasn't consulted, decisions made without him, futures discussed as if he wouldn't be there. Maybe you felt that before. Not in a wealthy family. Not with a will, but in your own way. Being the last to know, the first to be forgotten, the one who gives more than they receive. That's why this story hits so hard. Because it's not about fame or money. It's about belonging. And Nick says the moment he learned about the will, he stopped feeling like a son. He started feeling like a guest. And guests don't get permanence. Guests don't get loyalty. Guests can be removed. That shift matters. Because once someone reclassifies themselves in their own mind, their behavior changes. Their emotional restraints weaken. Their sense of consequence warps. Nick says he felt like something had already ended. Not a relationship, an identity. And when identity collapses, people become unpredictable. Now let's address the question everyone asks, but few examine honestly. Could this have been prevented? If someone had spoken sooner? If the will had been explained? If the silence had been broken? We don't know. But Nick says what hurt most wasn't the decision. It was the secrecy. And secrecy has weight. It builds pressure. It turns imagination against you. Because when no one explains, your mind fills in the gaps with the worst possible interpretations. And those interpretations don't need to be true to be powerful. They only need to feel true. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, Nick says the damage was already done. The emotional fracture had set. And once a fracture forms, it spreads. Silently. Until one day, everything breaks. But here's the part no one talks about. Nick didn't say the will made him angry. He said it made him disappear. And disappearance is more dangerous than rage. Because rage wants to be seen. Disappearance doesn't. Disappearance just stops caring. And that brings us to the most chilling part of this story. Because according to Nick, the betrayal wasn't just the will. It was realizing that the people he trusted most had already moved on without him. And if that's true, then the ending didn't begin on a Sunday. It began the moment he realized he was already gone. But what happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It wasn't obvious. It was a conversation, a realization, a moment Nick says he can't forget. And that moment, according to him, changed everything. Because once he heard it, once he understood what it meant, there was no going back. What if the most dangerous place in a family isn't outside the house, but inside it? Nick says the moment he realized something was wrong didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came with a feeling. The kind you can't quite explain at first. The kind you try to shake off because admitting it would mean admitting something worse. That you don't belong anymore. This is where his story really begins. Not with anger. Not with violence. But with distance that slowly turned familiar faces into strangers. Nick lived on the property, but not in the house. That detail sounds small until you sit with it. The guest house wasn't just a building. It was a boundary. A quiet one. A polite one. The kind that doesn't need words because everyone understands what it means. You're close, but not that close. You're family, but not central. You're included, but not essential. Ask yourself something. If someone you love moves you one step farther away every year, at what point do you stop calling it coincidence? Nick says, at first, it felt practical, convenient, a way to have independence while staying connected. That's how it was framed. That's how he wanted to believe it. But over time, small things started to add up. Meals happened without him. Conversations stopped when he entered the room. Plans were made that he learned about after the fact. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and say, this is it. Just enough to make you doubt yourself. And doubt is powerful. Because doubt makes you quiet. It makes you observant. It makes you replay interactions in your head late at night, wondering if you imagine the shift or if it's always been there. Nick says he told himself he was overthinking. That everyone gets busy. That families change. That being an adult means not needing constant reassurance. So he stayed loyal. He stayed available. He stayed silent. That silence matters. Because silence can look like strength from the outside, while turning into something corrosive on the inside. Nick says there were moments when he wanted to ask directly, am I still wanted here? Do I still matter to you? Is my place secure? But who asks their parents that? Who risks sounding needy? Weak? Ungrateful? So instead, he watched. He noticed how attention flowed. Who was consulted? Who was trusted with decisions? Who was treated like the future? And slowly, painfully, he realized something. The family had a center, and he wasn't in it. That realization doesn't hit all at once. It creeps in. It waits for moments when you're already tired, already vulnerable. Nick says it showed up in offhand comments, in jokes that landed wrong, in assumptions that he would always be around, but never in charge. Useful, reliable, peripheral. Have you ever been the person everyone depends on? But no one asks how you're doing? That's where resentment grows. Not from cruelty, but from imbalance. Nick says he gave without counting. Until one day, he started counting without meaning to. Who gets invited first? Who gets thanked publicly? Who gets defended? And who doesn't? Then there were the looks. He says you can feel when people are talking about you without you. The room changes. The energy shifts. Conversations get shorter. Answers get vaguer. It's subtle, but it's unmistakable. And when you live on the same property, those subtleties follow you everywhere. Every light turning off in the main house at night. Every laugh you hear through an open window. Every closed door. You're close enough to see what you're missing. That's the cruel part. Distance hurts, but proximity without inclusion hurts more. Nick says he started to feel like an afterthought in his own family. Not rejected outright, just quietly downgraded. And here's where the contradiction appears. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. The family was respected, successful, stable. People assumed warmth, unity, gratitude. But families don't collapse because of what outsiders see. They collapse because of what insiders feel but don't say. Nick says he became the family's constant. Always there when needed. Always available. Always assumed. And assumption kills appreciation. When someone is always there, people stop seeing the effort it takes. That's when loyalty starts to feel invisible. Then came the moment Nick says changed how he saw everything that came before. He overheard a conversation. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just casual. The kind of conversation people have when they assume no one is listening. He won't repeat the words exactly. But the message was clear. Decisions were being made. Futures were being planned. And he wasn't part of them. Imagine that. Hearing your life discussed as if it's already concluded. As if your role is settled. As if your presence is a given, but your importance is not. Nick says that was the first time the thought crossed his mind. What if I don't belong here as much as I think? That question is dangerous. Because once you ask it, you can't unask it. Every interaction afterward becomes evidence. Every slight feels intentional. Every exclusion feels personal. Nick says he tried to push the feeling down. He focused on routine, on helping, on staying useful. Because usefulness feels like safety. If they need me, they won't get rid of me. That was the logic. But need isn't the same as love. And usefulness isn't the same as belonging. Over time, he says, the guest house stopped feeling temporary. It started to feel symbolic. A place for someone who isn't fully inside. Someone close enough to serve, far enough to exclude. And when the will changed, all of that snapped into focus. Suddenly, every memory recontextualized itself. The distance wasn't accidental. The silence wasn't neutral. The exclusions weren't oversights. They were preparation. That's what Nick believes. And belief shapes reality. Because when you believe you're being phased out, every moment becomes loaded with meaning. Nick says the hardest part wasn't anger. It was humiliation. Knowing that decisions about his life were being made without him, while he continued to show up as if everything was normal. Have you ever smiled at people who have already decided you're disposable? That's what eats at you. Nick says he began to feel like he was performing a role, the loyal son, the dependable presence, while the real decisions happened elsewhere. And the worst part? No one ever said anything. No confrontation. No explanation. No acknowledgement. Silence again. And silence, when repeated long enough, becomes its own message. It says, you don't get answers. You don't get clarity. You don't get to object. Nick says he started sleeping less, thinking more, replaying conversations in his head, searching for signs he'd missed. Was there a moment he should have spoken up? Was there a line he crossed without knowing? Was there something he could have done differently? Those questions don't bring peace. They bring obsession. And obsession narrows your world. Everything becomes about interpretation, about meaning, about decoding behavior that was never explained. Nick says the property began to feel smaller, the walls closer, the air heavier. And still, he stayed. Why? Because leaving would have felt like confirmation. Confirmation that he was already out. So he waited. He watched. He absorbed. And then came the discovery that made everything undeniable. The will wasn't just changed. It was finalized. That detail matters. Because finalization means there was no intention to revisit. No intention to explain. No intention to include him later. Nick says that's when the emotional floor dropped out. Because up until that point, there was still plausible denial. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm misreading. Maybe this will resolve itself. But once the document existed, denial died. And with it, the version of himself that believed loyalty would be enough. Here's the contradiction that haunts this story. Nick says he loved his parents, and he believed they loved him. So how do those two things coexist with erasure? That's the question that broke him. Because if the people who raised you can remove you without explanation, what does love even mean? Nick says he didn't know how to reconcile it. So he didn't. He internalized it. And internalization is where things turn dangerous. When pain has nowhere to go, it turns inward. It distorts. It mutates. By the time anyone noticed something was wrong, Nick says he was already isolated inside his own head. Physically close. Emotionally alone. And here's the detail that still unsettles people. According to Nick, there was one final interaction. A moment. A realization. Something said, or implied. Something that confirmed his worst fear. That he wasn't just excluded. He was unwanted. That moment, he says, stripped away the last layer of restraint. Because restraint depends on hope. And once hope is gone, behavior changes. But that moment didn't happen in public. It didn't happen loudly. It happened quietly. And when it did, it set off a chain reaction no one could stop. Because after that realization, Nick says, nothing felt real anymore. Not the house. Not the family. Not the future. And when reality collapses, people do unpredictable things. But what exactly was said? What realization pushed him past the point of return? And why did one sister sense danger before anyone else acknowledged it? Because according to what comes next, the warning signs were there. They just weren't taken seriously. What makes someone say, look inside the family? Not, it must have been a break-in. Not, maybe someone from outside had a grudge. But inside, that's what allegedly happened when the Reiner's daughter, Romy, walked into the chaos that morning. According to reports, she was the one who made the discovery. She was the one who dialed. She was the one who said the words that changed everything. And those words weren't vague. They were chilling. He's still here. That's what law enforcement sources claim she said when they asked if there was anyone who could have done this. He's still here. That sentence didn't just point the investigation inward. It focused it. Immediately. Sharply. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. Not might be. Not could have been. Still here. 3 words that turned a family tragedy into something far darker. Now let's pause. Because this is the moment where most people think, well, there had to have been signs, right? And that's exactly what we're going to explore. Because according to Romy, there were. Let's rewind. What was really going on behind the gates of that $13.5 million Brentwood estate? From the outside, everything appeared polished. But Romy's instincts, it seems, had been sharpening for months. Friends say she'd expressed unease in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. A kind of low hum of tension. Not outright accusations, but little red flags. Conversations that felt rehearsed. Vibes that felt off. Energy that made her check behind her emotionally, even when nothing obvious had happened. Sometimes, You don't need a smoking gun to sense that something's wrong. You just need to know someone well enough to feel when their smile doesn't match their words. And Romy knew her brother better than anyone. She knew his patterns, his moods, his silences. And according to a source close to her, she had recently said this to a friend. He's been different. Like he's just waiting. Waiting for what? That's the question that keeps echoing through every room of that house. Was there something unspoken brewing beneath the surface? Some invisible countdown ticking in Nick's mind? Romy wasn't the only one to notice the shift. Tracy, the older sister, the more private one, had also grown quiet in recent months. She hadn't said as much, but those close to her said she'd begun pulling back. Not from her parents, but from Nick. Why? Was it because of behavior? Something he said? Or was it because of what she didn't say? Because silence can be its own alarm bell. And in some families, silence says more than any confrontation ever could. Let's look at the context. 3 adult children, 2 powerful parents, 1 sprawling estate. And somewhere inside that beautiful nightmare of real estate and unresolved tension, the cracks had started to widen. Nick wasn't in the main house, but he was never far. That guest house became more than a living space. It was a reminder, a signal. He was there, but not quite there. Present, but not fully trusted. Close, but somehow uncomfortably peripheral. And as the will shifted and family dynamics grew more formal, Romy began to worry. Because a shift in legal standing doesn't just impact the estate, it impacts relationships. You start to wonder, did they cut him out because something happened? Or is something going to happen because they cut him out? See how fast that flips. And the timeline matters here. Nick allegedly learned of the will revision 3 days before the deaths. But Romy? She sensed something before that, which raises a haunting possibility. What if Romy didn't just suspect that Nick might become unstable? What if she knew he already had? Let's go back to a family dinner, about 2 weeks before the incident. Sources say it was tense. Nick was present. So were Romy and Tracy. So were Rob and Michelle. But the seating arrangement told a story. Nick sat at the far end. The conversation, light at first, avoided any mention of finances, wills, or plans. But the elephant in the room, according to someone who heard about the dinner, was undeniable. Romy asked a seemingly innocent question. So what's the plan for the holidays? Silence. Then, Rob reportedly replied, we're figuring that out with Tracy. No mention of Nick. None. Just a casual dismissal. And Nick, people say, didn't react. Not then. Not with words. But his face changed. He went still. Too still. As if storing that moment. Logging it. Cataloging the insult. That's when Romy said her alarm bells really started. She later told a friend, it wasn't what he said. It was how quiet he got. Like he wasn't surprised at all. Like he expected it. Because when someone expects to be excluded, that's when they've already crossed into emotional exile. And emotional exile is where resentment festers. So what happens when that resentment finally boils over? Romy didn't have the answer, but she had a feeling. And 3 days later, that feeling became something far worse. Now picture it. It's Sunday. The house is quiet. And Romy arrives, planning to visit. She doesn't expect anything strange. Until she steps inside. The temperature in the house is wrong. Too still. Too cold. She calls out. No answer. She walks further. And that's when she finds them. The details don't need to be repeated here. They've been reported. The trauma doesn't need more oxygen. What matters is what she did in the next few seconds. She didn't call out for help. She called the police. And she said, he's still here. Think about that. She didn't say, I don't know what happened. She didn't say, I need help. She pointed. Immediately. Without hesitation. Which means the suspicion had already lived inside her. And that suspicion didn't come from nowhere. It came from patterns. From moments. From a dozen tiny red flags that, when viewed together, form one giant, flashing sign. Something's wrong here. So let's ask the question no one wants to answer. If Romy knew something was coming. If she felt the danger. If the family had been shifting its trust, its plans, its legal language. Then why didn't they act sooner? Why wasn't something done? Why did everyone keep pretending that the guest house was still just a guest house? And not the emotional ticking bomb they were all too afraid to name? Maybe it was love. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was fear of conflict or loyalty to appearances. or the hope that silence would somehow keep the storm from breaking. But storms don't ask for permission. They break when they're ready. And this one, it broke from the inside. Here's the final image. As the police arrive, as questions begin, as shock sets in, Nick is nowhere to be found. Not in the guest house. Not in the garden. Not in the house. But his car is there. His phone is off. And Romy? Romy is crying. But not with confusion. With recognition. Because sometimes, when a tragedy finally happens, you realize it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from every ignored instinct. Every moment you tried to explain away. Every gut feeling you drowned in logic. And by the time Romy realized she was right, it was already too late. But what happened when police finally found Nick? Where was he hiding? And what did he say when they asked the one question that haunted the entire family? Why? What he told them would stun even the investigators. Because according to Nick, he wasn't hiding at all. He was waiting. What kind of person doesn't run? That's the first thing detectives noticed when they found Nick. He wasn't in another city. He wasn't at a hotel. He wasn't even down the street. He was still there, just outside the main house. Sitting in the garden like he had every right to be there. Like nothing had happened. Like the family he'd just been cut out of, legally, emotionally, spiritually, hadn't just ended in silence and blood. No panic. No tears. Just waiting. Now think about that. Because most people, guilty or not, would be rattled. They'd be pacing, calling lawyers, locked in a room, crying, protesting, panicking. But Nick? He was calm. Too calm. And when the officers approached, there wasn't a moment of confusion. There wasn't a protest. There wasn't even a "what's going on?" He simply stood up, hands in full view. And according to one officer who later gave a statement, Nick said just one sentence. "I thought you'd be here sooner." Let that sink in. Not "I didn't do it." Not "what happened." But "I thought you'd be here sooner." It wasn't just a statement. It was a surrender. But not the panicked kind. Not the caught in the act kind. The inevitable kind. The kind that suggests he'd already accepted this moment days ago. Maybe even weeks. And when investigators brought him in, what followed wasn't a breakdown. It was a confession. But not the kind they expected. Because Nick didn't describe a crime. He described a funeral. His own. The moment the world changed, he said, was the moment he died. Emotionally. Psychologically. Existentially. Nick told detectives that everything that happened after that was a form of grief. A spiral. A collapse. A reaction, not an action. Was it manipulative? Was it a tactic? Or was it a chilling window into a man who genuinely believed he had already been erased? Nick said something that would end up in the report. Something strange and cold and unforgettable. When your own parents write you out of the story, you either disappear quietly or make sure they never forget you. Let's pause there, because that sentence is horrifying. And yet, it tells us everything about the mindset Nick claims he was in. Not rage, not revenge, not insanity, but something darker. Desperation for identity. Because once he was cut out of the will, he says, he wasn't just losing money. He was losing proof that he'd mattered at all. And when you feel erased, some people disappear. Others destroy. The detectives pushed him, of course. They wanted facts. Where he was. What he used. What happened in those final moments. But Nick was elusive. He didn't describe the act. He described the emotion. And every answer he gave came back to one core wound. I gave them everything. And they gave me silence. He said he'd been loyal. That he'd watched his sisters get credit for things he helped orchestrate. That he was always asked to show up, but never invited to decide. Nick talked about birthdays where his name wasn't on the card. Group texts he was left out of. Family vacations he found out about from Instagram. Little things. Petty things. Things that, on their own, sound small. But stacked together, they become a verdict. I was the invisible one, he said. They told me I was family, but they acted like I was furniture. And then came what detectives would later call the emotional climax of the interview. Nick leaned forward, looked one of them dead in the eyes, and asked, "If your parents erased you and nobody noticed, what would you do?" That's not the question of an innocent man, but it's not the question of a criminal either. It's the question of someone unraveling in plain sight. Someone who believes, truly believes, that his entire life was edited out of the final draft. Now think back. 3 days before the incident, he learns about the will. The will that, according to documents, left everything to Romy and Tracy. Not a share. Not a trust. Not a single mention of Nick. Was it legal? Yes. Was it cruel? That depends on what you believe. But what's undeniable is this. To Nick, it felt like a bullet. Not because of the money, but because of what the money symbolized. He said to investigators, "They made it official. I was no longer theirs." And once he believed that, once he internalized that, something cracked. Because Nick didn't describe his actions as decisions. He described them as inevitable. Like a final chapter someone else had already written, he just turned the page. Investigators didn't buy it at first. They thought it was an act, a manipulation. But as the hours passed, they started to see something worse. This wasn't performance. This was a man who had built an entire belief system around being betrayed. And belief systems are powerful. They create their own logic. They justify anything. Nick wasn't pleading for sympathy. He wasn't even angry. He was resigned, detached, as if nothing he said would change what had already been taken from him. Because in his mind, the story was over. The tragedy had already happened. The moment the will changed. Everything after that, just fallout. Here's where it gets even more unsettling. When asked if he regretted anything, Nick paused. Not for a second. For almost a minute. He just stared at the table. And then he said, "I regret not saying goodbye. Not I regret what I did. Not I wish it hadn't happened. Just goodbye." That silence shook even the officers in the room. Because it suggested something chilling. That Nick didn't see the act as violence. He saw it as closure. A way to make sure he wasn't the only one feeling erased. That's where the mind fractures. Where logic stops functioning. Where grief turns into action. Twisted, irreversible action. So what happens next? Nick is booked. Formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. No bail. Family is notified. Media erupts. The Brentwood house becomes a crime scene. A symbol, not of celebrity, but of secrets. And outside, in the noise and chaos and flashing cameras, a question starts circling that no one can answer. Did anyone see this coming? The answer depends on who you ask. Some say yes. That Romy knew. That Tracy suspected. That even Rob and Michelle had been keeping their distance. Others say no. That this was unthinkable. That the Nick they knew would never. But which Nick did they know? The loyal son in the guest house? Or the invisible man quietly eroding behind polite smiles? Because one thing is clear now. Whatever version they thought they knew, it wasn't the one sitting in custody. And as Nick is led away in cuffs, eyes blank, lips silent, the question still hangs in the air. What if the will had never been changed? Would they all still be alive? Or was this always going to happen? That's the horror of it. We'll never know. But what we do know is that Romy and Tracy now face a future without their parents. And with a brother they'll never forgive. But what happens when the sisters discover one more document, hidden deep inside their father's safe? A document no one expected. A letter addressed to Nick. Have you ever opened a letter and felt the room shift around you? Not because of what was written, but because of who it was from. That's what Romy allegedly experienced when, days after the arrest, she and Tracy were sorting through their father's personal safe and found it. A sealed envelope, addressed in their father's handwriting. To Nick. No title, no date, no legal jargon. Just a name. Nick. And just like that, the narrative everyone thought they understood cracked open. Because if Rob Reiner truly wanted nothing to do with his son, why would he write him a letter? And why hide it? Why lock it away? Let's walk through this moment. Because it reshaped everything the sisters thought they knew. Romy was reaching for a stack of financial documents. Tracy was reading through insurance forms. They were looking for closure, the kind that comes in paperwork, not in grief. Then Romy found it. The envelope was placed beneath a false panel. A small metal plate slid out of place when she shifted a ledger. Behind it, the letter sat upright, as if waiting to be discovered. She didn't open it. Not at first. She called Tracy over. They stared at it, in silence. Because even in the chaos of the past few days, the shock, the media, the investigators, the funeral arrangements, nothing had hit them quite like this. A personal letter to the very person they believed was responsible for everything that had just happened. What was inside? An apology? A warning? A goodbye? Romy, hands shaking, finally opened it. What she read would leave her speechless. Because the letter wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't angry. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't filled with accusations or regrets. It was conflicted. Raw. Real. Rob had written it just a week before his death. And it began with this line: "I don't know how to reach you anymore, so I'm writing this instead." That one sentence shattered everything, because it suggested something that hadn't been public, that Rob had been trying, that Rob saw something unraveling in Nick and felt powerless to stop it. The rest of the letter only deepened the complexity. Rob didn't mince words. He acknowledged the distance, the tension, the arguments. He admitted mistakes, but he also stood firm. He explained why the will was changed, not out of anger, he wrote, but out of fear. Fear that Nick was spiraling. Fear that involving him in the estate would bring more pain than peace. He wrote, "You've been angry for so long, Nick, and I don't know where it comes from anymore." That line, according to Romy, hit like a thunderclap, because it reframed the family dynamic. It wasn't just a betrayal narrative. It was a breakdown, a slow-motion collapse between a father and son who had once been close, now strangers, watching each other drown from opposite shores. The letter continued. Rob acknowledged that he hadn't done everything right. He admitted to favoring structure over emotion. He admitted to being more of a builder than a listener. But he also included a chilling premonition. He wrote, "I don't know what's going to happen when you read this. I just hope it's not too late." And there it was, the sentence that made Romy gasp. Because whether Rob knew something was coming or just feared it, the letter had become a ghost. A voice from beyond the grave, echoing with tragic timing. The final paragraph was brief. Rob told Nick he loved him, that no matter how the will ended up, the bond, in his heart, remained. And he closed with 5 words. "You're still my son, Nick." That broke Tracy. She reportedly had to leave the room, because the contradiction was unbearable. If he was still his son, why cut him out? If he still loved him, why leave the letter hidden? And if he feared him, why not do more? These are the questions no one can answer, because Rob Reiner isn't here anymore. And Nick? Nick is in custody, unreachable, unreconcilable. That letter didn't bring peace. It brought confusion. It exposed the haunting truth of many families. Love can exist alongside fear. Affection can coexist with boundaries. And silence doesn't always mean indifference. Sometimes it means despair. Romy and Tracy had to decide what to do next. Should they give the letter to Nick? Should they let it be used in court? Should they even acknowledge it publicly? They didn't agree. Tracy wanted it sealed again. Romy believed it should be read. And that's when another storm began to brew between the sisters themselves. Because grief doesn't unify people automatically. Sometimes it divides them more deeply, especially when the person responsible for that grief is family, and especially when one sister believes in punishment, while the other starts to wonder if forgiveness might matter, too. That rift didn't explode immediately. It started subtly, in how they handled the press, in how they responded to the DA, in whether or not they chose to attend Nick's arraignment. Tracy refused. Romy hesitated. But days later, she went. Not to speak, not to plead, but to look at him, to see the brother she once loved, through the glass. And what she saw changed her forever, because Nick looked back and mouthed just 2 words. "You knew, did she?" That was the question that followed Romy out of the courtroom and into every sleepless night that came after. "You knew." 2 words. Silent. No sound. Just lips forming an accusation that cut deeper than anything spoken aloud. Nick didn't shout. He didn't cry. He didn't look angry. He looked certain. And certainty is terrifying when it comes from someone who believes the story has already been written. Romy froze. For a split second, she forgot where she was. The courtroom, the guards, the cameras, all of it faded behind one impossible thought. What if he's right? What if she had known more than she wanted to admit? That look haunted her, because it wasn't rage she saw in his eyes. It was disappointment, like a verdict he'd already reached. After that moment, Romy didn't speak to the press. She didn't answer texts. She didn't return calls from extended family. She went home and sat in silence, replaying every memory, every conversation, every instinct she'd brushed aside. The late-night pacing, the quiet withdrawal, the way Nick had stopped arguing altogether. She remembered thinking at the time that it was growth, maturity, acceptance. Now she wondered if it was resignation. Because people don't always get louder before they break. Sometimes they get calm. Too calm. Tracy, on the other hand, had no doubts. She was furious. At Nick. At Romy. At the letter. She believed the letter changed nothing. That it was a distraction. A manipulation from beyond the grave that would only muddy what was already clear. He did this, Tracy reportedly said, and nothing in that letter changes that. But Romy couldn't let it go, because the letter didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like regret, and regret implies awareness, which meant someone, somewhere in that family, had known things weren't right. The question was who knew what and when. As the case moved forward, prosecutors focused on motive. And motive, they argued, was obvious. Inheritance, resentment, opportunity. Nick had access. Nick lived on the property. Nick had expressed dissatisfaction, open and shut. But the defense took a different approach. They didn't deny the facts. They reframed the story. They painted Nick not as a mastermind, but as a man emotionally exiled long before any charges were filed. They pointed to the guest house. They pointed to the will. They pointed to the letter. They asked the jury a question that made the courtroom uncomfortable. If you believe a person has already lost everything, what do you think they're capable of? That question divided people instantly. Online, comments exploded. Some saw Nick as a monster who used family tension as an excuse. Others saw him as a cautionary tale of emotional neglect and unaddressed mental collapse. But what most people missed was the timeline. Because the defense uncovered something unexpected. A series of appointments, private consultations, sessions Nick had been attending quietly in the months before the incident. He had been seeking help. That detail stopped the courtroom cold, not because it excused anything, but because it complicated everything. If Nick was spiraling, he knew it. If Rob sensed something was wrong, he knew it, which means this wasn't a surprise. It was a slow-moving disaster. And slow disasters are the hardest to stop, because everyone assumes there's still time. The defense presented evidence that Nick had attempted to speak to his parents more than once. Texts that went unanswered, emails left on read, voicemails never returned. Not confrontational, not threatening, just asking to be heard, asking to be included, asking what he had done wrong. The prosecution argued those messages showed obsession. The defense argued they showed desperation. And the jury watched, torn between two narratives that both felt horrifying. On one side, a man who committed an unforgivable act. On the other, a family that may have ignored a collapse happening right in front of them. The letter became central, not as evidence of innocence, but as evidence of awareness. Rob knew something was wrong. He wrote it, he hid it, and he didn't send it. Why? That question followed every witness to the stand. Was he afraid of confrontation? Was he hoping things would resolve themselves? Was he trying to protect the daughters? Or was he afraid of what Nick might do if pushed further? No one could answer that, because fear doesn't leave a paper trail, and love doesn't always look the way we want it to. Romy testified. Her voice shook. She spoke about her childhood, about how close they once were, about how things changed slowly, almost invisibly. She admitted she had felt uneasy. She admitted she hadn't known what to do with that feeling. She admitted she'd chosen silence over conflict. And when asked whether she regretted that choice, she broke. Yes, she said. Every day. That moment changed public perception. Because regret isn't guilt. But it's not innocence either. It's something messier. Something human. Tracy never took the stand. She didn't need to. Her position was clear. This wasn't about feelings. This was about consequences. And consequences, she believed, had already been decided. As the trial dragged on, the house in Brentwood sat empty. No lights, no laughter, no future, just a structure holding memories no one wanted to touch. Neighbors avoided it. Press stopped camping outside. The story moved from headlines to whispers. But inside that courtroom, the tension only grew. Because one final piece of evidence was about to be introduced. Something no one knew existed. A recorded voicemail, left by Nick. Not to his parents, to himself. A message saved on his phone just hours before everything happened. The judge allowed it. The courtroom went silent. The audio crackled, and Nick's voice filled the room. Not angry, not loud, just tired. What he said in that message would change how everyone saw the case. Because it wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plan. It was a goodbye. And as the final words played, even the prosecution looked shaken. Because once you hear it, once you understand what he believed in that moment, you're forced to confront a terrifying possibility. That this wasn't a crime driven by greed. It was a collapse driven by despair. But the jury still had one question left. One that would determine everything. Did despair explain what happened, or did it simply make it unforgivable? And the answer to that question would decide Nick's fate. What does a goodbye sound like when the person leaving doesn't believe they'll be remembered? The voicemail was only 47 seconds long. No dramatic music. No sobbing. No rage. Just breathing. Then Nick's voice. Flat. Calm. Almost careful. The courtroom leaned forward as if the words themselves might escape if no one listened closely enough. I don't know how else to say this, he began. I've tried everything I know how to try. That was the opening line. Not an apology. Not an accusation. A statement of exhaustion. Nick didn't address his parents. He didn't address his sisters. He addressed himself. That alone unsettled people. Because messages you leave for yourself are rarely lies. They're the things you believe when no one is watching. He talked about feeling invisible. About being present but uncounted. About the moment he realized his future had been rewritten without him. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, he said, they'd notice. That line hit the room like a punch. Because it exposed the core contradiction of his entire story. He wasn't trying to be heard loudly. He was trying to be noticed quietly. And quiet people don't always get noticed until it's too late. The voicemail continued. Nick described the guest house as a waiting room. A place where he sat, day after day, believing something would eventually change. He said he felt like a placeholder. Someone who kept the family running while others moved forward. I don't hate them, he said. I just don't know who I am without them. That sentence fractured the room. Because hatred is easy to understand. Identity loss is not. Hatred has a target. Identity loss is directionless. It eats inward. Nick's voice wavered for the first time near the end. Not crying. Just thinning. I hope this makes sense someday, he said. I hope someone understands. Then silence. The recording ended. No confession. No plan. No mention of what would happen next. Just a man speaking into the void, convinced the void was the only place left that would listen. The prosecution stood slowly. They reminded the jury that despair does not excuse action. That pain does not justify destruction. That no amount of emotional injury gives someone the right to take lives. They were right. But the defense didn't argue otherwise. They argued something more dangerous. That the voicemail wasn't proof of innocence. It was proof of inevitability. Because when someone believes they've already lost everything that defines them, they stop measuring consequences the same way. They stop weighing tomorrow against today. They stop believing there is a future worth preserving. The defense didn't ask the jury to forgive Nick. They asked them to understand the collapse. And understanding, they warned, is not the same as excusing. As the trial entered its final phase, public opinion splintered. Some people saw the voicemail as calculated. A preemptive emotional shield. Others saw it as a man documenting his own disappearance. Comment sections turned vicious. He wanted attention. They ignored him until he snapped. He's evil. He's broken. No one agreed. And maybe that's because the truth lived somewhere in between. Romy couldn't stop listening to the voicemail. She played it late at night, alone in her apartment, lights off, phone glowing like an accusation. Every time, the same line caught her breath. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough, they'd notice. She thought about all the times she'd mistaken quiet for strength. All the times she'd told herself Nick was fine because he wasn't complaining. All the times she'd chosen peace over confrontation. And she wondered something she'd never said out loud. What if silence wasn't patience? What if it was surrender? Tracy refused to listen to the voicemail again. She said it didn't matter. She said focusing on feelings was how people avoided accountability. But even she couldn't escape the ripple effect. Friends began asking uncomfortable questions. Had Rob been afraid of Nick? Had Michelle been conflicted? Why was the letter hidden instead of delivered? Why change the will so close to the end? Why not involve a mediator? A counselor? Anyone? Those questions didn't accuse Tracy directly, but they hovered. Like smoke. The jury deliberated longer than expected. Hours stretched into days. Every decision felt impossible. If they focused only on the act, the verdict was clear. If they considered the context, it became unbearable. Because context doesn't excuse, but it explains. An explanation changes how punishment feels. Inside his holding cell, Nick waited. He didn't call anyone. He didn't write letters. He didn't ask about the jury. According to a guard, he spent most of the time sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. Not anxious. Not hopeful. Resigned. as if the outcome no longer mattered. That resignation terrified people more than anger ever could. Because anger wants a result. Resignation accepts whatever comes. When the jury finally returned, the courtroom filled again. Romy sat rigid. Tracy stared straight ahead. Nick stood. The foreperson's hands shook as the verdict was read. Guilty. Both counts. The room exhaled. Some people cried. Some nodded. Some looked away. Justice delivered. But justice doesn't always bring clarity. As Nick was led away, he didn't look at the jury. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at Romy. Just once. And this time, he didn't mouth words. He smiled. Not cruelly. Sadly. Like someone finally released from waiting. That image would haunt Romy for years. Because it looked like relief. Sentencing was scheduled weeks later. Time enough for statements. Time enough for reflection. Time enough for one final twist. Because as the sentencing date approached, the defense filed a last-minute motion. They had uncovered something new. Something buried. Something no one had noticed before. A financial transfer. Small. Easy to miss. But timed exactly with the will revision. Money moved quietly. From Rob's personal account. Into a trust. Not for Romy. Not for Tracy. For Nick. And the memo line read. For stability. That detail didn't erase anything. It didn't change the verdict. But it changed the story. Because it suggested that even as Rob removed Nick from the will, he was still trying to protect him, still trying to provide, still trying to help from a distance he didn't know how to cross. Love, tangled with fear. Care, wrapped in boundaries. A final attempt at control instead of connection. When Romy learned about the trust, she broke down. Because it meant something unbearable. That her father had loved Nick. And feared him. At the same time. And fear won. Now ask yourself this. If Rob had sat down with Nick, if he'd explained the will, if he'd handed him the letter instead of hiding it, if he'd chosen confrontation over silence, would this story still exist? No one can answer that. But everyone has an opinion. At sentencing, Nick spoke. Just once. He didn't argue the verdict. He didn't plead for mercy. He said this. I waited my whole life to be seen. This is the last thing I wanted to be seen for. Then he was taken away. Life. The house was sold months later. The guest house demolished. Romy moved out of state. Tracy cut off most public contact. The letter was sealed. The trust frozen. And the family name became synonymous not with success, but with warning. Because this story isn't just about a crime. It's about what happens when love is withheld instead of explained. When fear replaces conversation. When silence becomes policy. And when someone mistakes quiet for safety. The final question isn't whether Nick deserved forgiveness. It's whether anyone listens soon enough. And the most haunting part? What makes someone say, look inside the family? Not, it must have been a break-in. Not, maybe someone from outside had a grudge. But inside, that's what allegedly happened when the Reiner's daughter, Romy, walked into the chaos that morning. According to reports, she was the one who made the discovery. She was the one who dialed. She was the one who said the words that changed everything. And those words weren't vague. They were chilling. He's still here. That's what law enforcement sources claim she said when they asked if there was anyone who could have done this. He's still here. That sentence didn't just point the investigation inward. It focused it. Immediately. Sharply. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. Not might be. Not could have been. Still here. 3 words that turned a family tragedy into something far darker. Now let's pause. Because this is the moment where most people think, well, there had to have been signs, right? And that's exactly what we're going to explore. Because according to Romy, there were. Let's rewind. What was really going on behind the gates of that $13.5 million Brentwood estate? From the outside, everything appeared polished. But Romy's instincts, it seems, had been sharpening for months. Friends say she'd expressed unease in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. A kind of low hum of tension. Not outright accusations, but little red flags. Conversations that felt rehearsed. Vibes that felt off. Energy that made her check behind her emotionally, even when nothing obvious had happened. Sometimes, you don't need a smoking gun to sense that something's wrong. You just need to know someone well enough to feel when their smile doesn't match their words. And Romy knew her brother. Better than anyone. She knew his patterns, his moods, his silences. And according to a source close to her, she had recently said this to a friend. He's been different. Like he's just waiting. Waiting for what? That's the question that keeps echoing through every room of that house. Was there something unspoken brewing beneath the surface? Some invisible countdown ticking in Nick's mind? Romy wasn't the only one to notice the shift. Tracy, the older sister, the more private one, had also grown quiet in recent months. She hadn't said as much, but those close to her said she'd begun pulling back. Not from her parents, but from Nick. Why? Was it because of behavior? Something he said? Or was it because of what she didn't say? Because silence can be its own alarm bell. And in some families, silence says more than any confrontation ever could. Let's look at the context. 3 adult children, 2 powerful parents, 1 sprawling estate, and somewhere inside that beautiful nightmare of real estate and unresolved tension, the cracks had started to widen. Nick wasn't in the main house, but he was never far. That guest house became more than a living space. It was a reminder, a signal. He was there, but not quite there. Present, but not fully trusted. Close, but somehow uncomfortably peripheral. And as the will shifted and family dynamics grew more formal, Romy began to worry. Because a shift in legal standing doesn't just impact the estate, it impacts relationships. You start to wonder, did they cut him out because something happened? Or is something going to happen because they cut him out? See how fast that flips. And the timeline matters here. Nick allegedly learned of the will revision 3 days before the deaths. But Romy? She sensed something before that, which raises a haunting possibility. What if Romy didn't just suspect that Nick might become unstable? What if she knew he already had? Let's go back to a family dinner, about 2 weeks before the incident. Sources say it was tense. Nick was present. So were Romy and Tracy. So were Rob and Michelle. But the seating arrangement told a story. Nick sat at the far end. The conversation, light at first, avoided any mention of finances, wills, or plans. But the elephant in the room, according to someone who heard about the dinner, was undeniable. Romy asked a seemingly innocent question. So what's the plan for the holidays? Silence. Then, Rob reportedly replied, we're figuring that out with Tracy. No mention of Nick. None. Just a casual dismissal. And Nick, people say, didn't react. Not then. Not with words. But his face changed. He went still. Too still. As if storing that moment. Logging it. Cataloging the insult. That's when Romy said her alarm bells really started. She later told a friend, it wasn't what he said. It was how quiet he got. Like he wasn't surprised at all. Like he expected it. Because when someone expects to be excluded, that's when they've already crossed into emotional exile. And emotional exile is where resentment festers. So what happens when that resentment finally boils over? Romy didn't have the answer, but she had a feeling. And 3 days later, that feeling became something far worse. Now picture it. It's Sunday. The house is quiet. And Romy arrives, planning to visit. She doesn't expect anything strange. Until she steps inside. The temperature in the house is wrong. Too still. Too cold. She calls out. No answer. She walks further. And that's when she finds them. The details don't need to be repeated here. They've been reported. The trauma doesn't need more oxygen. What matters is what she did in the next few seconds. She didn't call out for help. She called the police. And she said, he's still here. Think about that. She didn't say, I don't know what happened. She didn't say, I need help. She pointed. Immediately. Without hesitation. Which means the suspicion had already lived inside her. And that suspicion didn't come from nowhere. It came from patterns. From moments. From a dozen tiny red flags that, when viewed together, form one giant, flashing sign. Something's wrong here. So let's ask the question no one wants to answer. If Romy knew something was coming. If she felt the danger. If the family had been shifting its trust, its plans, its legal language. Then why didn't they act sooner? Why wasn't something done? Why did everyone keep pretending that the guest house was still just a guest house? And not the emotional ticking bomb they were all too afraid to name? Maybe it was love. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was fear of conflict or loyalty to appearances, or the hope that silence would somehow keep the storm from breaking. But storms don't ask for permission. They break when they're ready. And this one? It broke from the inside. Here's the final image. As the police arrive, as questions begin, as shock sets in, Nick is nowhere to be found. Not in the guest house. Not in the garden. Not in the house. But his car is there. His phone is off. And Romy? Romy is crying. but not with confusion, with recognition. Because sometimes, when a tragedy finally happens, you realize it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from every ignored instinct, every moment you tried to explain away, every gut feeling you drowned in logic. And by the time Romy realized she was right, it was already too late. But what happened when police finally found Nick? Where was he hiding? And what did he say when they asked the one question?